a special presentation of LLBN with archaeologists Dr. Lawrence Garrity and Dr. Doug Clark. Excavating the Bible.
Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, what archaeology can teach us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of archaeology in the Middle East to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, and am joined on the set for this program with Dr. Larry Garrity and Dr. Kent Bramlett, both of whom share my enthusiasm for archaeology and our training in archaeology and in Old Testament and in biblical studies. Larry, you have been president of La Sierra University. You continue to work for La Sierra to help support the archaeological cause. And Kent, an associate professor of archaeology and the history of antiquity. Thank you both for joining us for this conversation in a long series. We don't know how long. I'm not sure we can predict how long, of walking through the entire Bible, book by book, thinking about archaeology and the Bible. We have spent a couple of episodes in Deuteronomy. We are now in the final episode of Deuteronomy. What do you like about Deuteronomy? And maybe, what don't you like about Deuteronomy? What do you like about it?
I like it because it's a series of sermons, very practical assistance for everyday life, and it's a kind of a summary of the material that has come before in the Pentateuch, but cast in a homiletical style with Moses as the preacher, and you presume that it contains what he especially wanted people to know as they were coming into the Promised Land. And
so the sermon not only carries that kind of flavor of invitation and of persuasion, but it's framed right on the borders of the Promised Land. So that's important, certainly in their context. What would it mean to later audiences to think about this sermon on the borders of a land of hope? What would that mean?
I've certainly heard contemporary preachers using it as a foil for us, where we stand in history, looking forward to the denouement of God's kingdom.
Right. The same kind of model, isn't it?
Yeah.
And a model that is built on hope, even though we don't normally read Deuteronomy. I think maybe that's because we're pretty selective, and so we read parts of it, and that doesn't warm our hearts, but maybe the whole thing. What do you think, Kent?
Well, I was just thinking back to the first time we read through the Bible as a family. I was probably less than 10, and going through the Book of Kings and making a chart: good king, bad king. Well, mostly bad king, bad king, bad king. Deuteronomy explains that, the whole sense of how ancient Israel understood their history. What are they evaluating these kings on? I mean, loosely, whether they followed God or not. But it's really Deuteronomy, and you know, it's this bit here, the covenant, that lays it out for us. This is sort of the founding document which tells us how they understood the rest of biblical history.
Well, and I think it's that childhood insight, Kent. Well, not only signaled great things, we knew that, but it signaled what I think most scholars think now about kings and about Joshua and Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, which we call Deuteronomistic or Deuteronomic history, because it's built on the theology, primarily the theology of what we call act consequence. Obedience leads to this, which is usually success, prosperity, posterity, long life, die in peace, and have a great funeral. That's kind of the everyday sense of what the good life was in ancient times. And disobedience led to the opposite of all of those. And it's that theology, I think that's tremendously insightful. It's that theology that governs this collection of history books. And that's how the kings are judged. So Deuteronomy, I've heard you say that Deuteronomy may be the most theological book.
I would make the argument.
So you're still standing on that.
I'm standing by that one.
We have, before we turn to the last part of Deuteronomy, we have some artifacts on the tables in front of us. Let's just take a brief minute and think about these. Coming from what time period and illustrating what?
Well, this is the time period of the Exodus of Moses, and when I look at a collection of pottery from a given time period, what I see is a culture. If I were to look at pottery of the early Israelites in the land, I would see very utilitarian pottery. There's no paint, well, maybe on one form. They're just cooking pots, storage jars, and pouring, liquid storage containers. That's it. But when I look here, I see bronze. Bronze takes tin. From where? Well, maybe some from Turkey, but Afghanistan. Tin is why the Romans went to England, Cornwall. So I see that, international trade. I see vessels from Cyprus that contain products, again, coming from different parts of the world. And there's paint on these. Forms which are imitated then in Israel, Palestine. Again, from Cyprus, the style comes in. So this speaks to a culture which is very international. Which actually, they don't know it, but it's at the end of that period. It's about to collapse. Which gives Israel the chance to emerge as a nation.
So if Moses walked into the room right now, he'd feel very at home looking at what's on the tables.
He would know these forms. He would have used vessels like these.
And weapons like those.
Yep.
And yes, on the
far
you
think of the poor Egyptian that died and Moses had to run. We've got a dagger right there.
And he'd look at that little model of the Hammurabi thing, and he said, that looks vaguely familiar, but the last one I saw was a lot larger.
This is the pocket version, the Reader's Digest.
This is the Reader's Digest version of Hammurabi's code, which of course is important in comparing the stipulations in the law code. We're now past that in the book of Deuteronomy. We're coming to the end. But in any case, the Code of Hammurabi was very significant.
And I think it's important to say that Hammurabi was a king who lived in Mesopotamia and promulgated these laws based on what he felt was a revelation from his God. And he set these stela up around the kingdom that he was responsible for, so that the people who lived in the cities of his realm would know what was expected of them in terms of behavior, right?
Right. And that would have been their context. That would have been their world.
I mean, there's earlier ones that he's copying from.
That's true.
But he's still receiving the law from Shamash, who's God. So it's this
localized,
divine,
what, for this territory? For this land?
Yeah, he's the king of Babylon. It's for his territory.
And so we would have Yahweh receiving or giving law for his land. I mean, that's why we have it.
The first one of those to be found was actually in what we would call Persia or Iran today. So his kingdom extended throughout Mesopotamia.
So artifacts coming from the time period. Let's think now, we'll turn our attention to some slides and think about this part of the book of Deuteronomy and maybe how archaeology can contribute to our understanding of it. So we turn to the outline. Talk to us, Kent and Larry, about this outline.
Well, you've mentioned the sermon sequence here. The first sermon is fairly short, so some people would have approved of that one, I suppose. But it's really the background. It's getting the people into the context. Who are we talking about? So it provides the setting. The second sermon is the one we dealt with last time, and that's much of the book. These are the sections of law. And now we're into the third section. This is where it all comes together. This is the covenant. And it's laid out. If you do these things, you will be blessed. If you don't, the curses will fall upon you. And again, we saw how this follows the law formulation, the covenant formula.
And the primary illustration of that being the Hittite.
Right.
And in fact, you can move through this sermon and see elements of the preamble, certainly the stipulations, and you have the blessings and the cursings in chapters 27 and 28. And then we now are sealing the deal. And then there's a little bit of business to take care of, so some housekeeping in the process. I would like to ask a question about this very dense slide. And we expect everybody on their TV screens to move very close and to be able to read all of this. This is a collection of the listings in the Bible Old and New Testament, of the 12 tribes. And I put it here because the 12 tribes figure prominently in these closing comments, and in the song of Moses, and in the blessing of the tribes, especially in the blessing of the tribe. In
Two of
chapter
Israel's oldest poems, we could call them.
Correct.
Yeah.
The poetry.
The poetry.
Poetry lasts. People might like poetry better if they knew that it really did last.
Yeah.
And in this case, I do want to explain a couple things, and Larry can't help me out here as I miss something. And I'm going to do this. This is very, what's the word I want? This is just a kind of an image. You're going to see colors. You might even see patterns. You might even see something that isn't here because it's so small. We're going to, in the next slide, we'll get closer and we'll see it better. But these are the listings. 3, 4 in Genesis of the 12 tribes of Israel. Then Genesis 29 and following, this is their birth order as it's reported. Exodus has it once. Numbers has it several times. In fact, several times. Deuteronomy has it a couple of times. Joshua has it a couple of times. Judges. Then we go all the way to Chronicles, and then a couple in Ezekiel, and one in the book of Revelation in the New Testament. So there are 25 of these lists.
I bet most people watching did not realize that there were 25 listings of the sons of Jacob.
I think I had to discover this with time too.
From Genesis to Revelation.
Right.
Yeah. We're talking about the whole Bible here. Now the colors represent mothers, and so red or any tinted red comes from Leah, the first wife of Jacob. Anything that is blue comes from Bilhah, and then what is green comes from Zilpah. These were maids of, we'll kind of point out who they were, and then anything yellow or yellow tinted comes from Rachel. These lists tell us a lot, I think, about the tribes. A couple of things. What do you think? You're looking at this. This is kind of a pattern, but what do you think about what we might learn from looking at them all together?
The interesting thing that strikes me right off the bat is that sometimes certain names are missing, and sometimes instead of Joseph are the names of his 2 sons.
Right.
You know?
In order to indicate how the tribal allocations actually ended up. Joseph, we don't have a Joseph territory.
Right.
So we have an Ephraim and
a Manasseh.
And a Manasseh.
And I sort of compare it to, we talk about in archaeology about the Decapolis cities, the cities during New Testament times, the Decapolis, 10 cities that were especially important. And when they're listed, sometimes they're 7, sometimes they're 9, sometimes they're 10 or more. And so the listing of cities changes from time to time. And so you ask, why is that happening? And so it's interesting to ask the question that you're asking us, why are these lists different? Why are some names there sometimes and they're not? And you know, what's going on here?
And tribes can bifurcate, they can divide.
That's right.
Tribes come together, and then you look at a earlier ancestor, a eponymous founder. So tribal identities are fluid, and anthropologists have been really interested in how lineages work, and they've done a lot of study on this.
In fact, I think some of our colleagues at Andrews have written about tribal affiliations being more stable if it's in an agrarian or agricultural society. If it's more of a shepherd nomadic society, there tend to be changing loyalties, and they're considered part of the tribe. So we need to be aware, as science continues to tell us new things about tribal entities, that maybe these dynamics are really quite intriguing. What else do you notice on the lists?
I was just going to say that all 3 of us work in Jordan in our field work, and there we have met up with tribes, Bedouin tribes, that are in a sense more important to people, their allegiances to these tribes, than they are even to the national government or to other forms of government. And most of the people who work for us comes, of course, from the tribe that is geographically around the sites that we work. So we've gotten the insights into how important tribal societies are in our own work.
And the relative status, hierarchies between tribes.
Right.
I've noticed in Jordan, if they come from a powerful, prominent tribe, they're very quick to tell you.
Yeah.
And then if they're not from a powerful tribe, maybe one of the lesser ones, they won't put that forward. And if there are other Jordanians around, they'll even be hesitant to say. So hierarchies are important too. And that may be what's going on here with the different ordering that we have, even where the names are the same. Right. There's different prominences being indicated.
Sorry, I interrupted you. Just ask a question.
Well, I think it was a great interruption. So, but anything more about this list?
The numbers. We know there's 12 tribes, right?
Right.
Well, sometimes.
Sometimes, right.
So if you count this one, there are 12, but there's no, we don't have the children. Actually, are there 12? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So there are 12 here. There seems to be more as we go along here. The red here, this is one of Leah's children, Levi. Levi is omitted from these lists 7 times. Okay.
He didn't have a territory, did he?
He didn't have a territory.
In the allocation of the geography.
Could well explain it. It's certainly where they're laying out territory. In other places, they're not laying out territory. So people have asked the question. In fact, some people would argue, some scholars would argue that the tribe of Levi at least becomes more of a guild of priestly and temple functionaries. In the book of Judges, you have toward the end of the book, a person of the tribe of Judah, it's very clear, tribe of Judah, who is a Levite. So there may be some other things that are going on here too, as we actually look at just even the biblical data.
One of the interesting things is that Reuben is almost always the first across those lists you can see. He was certainly the first to get territory, right, as they came out of their wilderness wanderings. Reuben's is the first. And we have a professor that we know who has written that up based on the archaeological work that we have done in the territory of Reuben, talking about the significance and how maybe he got that prominence.
And there is a relatively new scholarly book out, a dissertation from a school where Kent attended and earned your PhD at the University of Toronto. And his book is all about the Reubenites and the Gadites, primarily. It's the land between two rivers. And he's using our site as basically a type site for this change between the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age around 1200. And he talks about these tribal entities. And the archaeological evidence, it's not just biblical, but the archaeological evidence suggests these tribal the tribal presence there of these groups. Let me get to a closer look here. I think we can now take off our very fine reading glasses and now look at these particular ones. These are simply examples. And I take this one because this is the original birth order. And then here, this is the passage we're looking at now. And Simeon is somehow off the list or isn't mentioned. Talk to us about Simeon.
Well,
what's unusual about Simeon?
Well, one thing that's unusual is we know the 10 northern tribes of Israel, right, and the 2 southern tribes of the kingdom of Judah after the United Monarchy
Judah
splits.
and Benjamin, right.
But that's always I mean, that has to be a sort of a, what do we want to call it, a ideological construct, because Simeon is in the southwest, always was, every list in the southwest of Judah. So that territory clearly includes the 3, Benjamin, Judah, and Simeon. But Simeon already had either dispersed or lost its identity, although we have Simeonites later, so probably was more dispersed. And in the north, then, we're supposed to have 10 tribes, but Reuben's probably already lost. And so these identities trace back, but in reality, times have moved on.
Now, these tend to be blessings. These tend to be, here's what we want to wish for these tribal groups. Was Simeon simply not noted or not known, or was there some problem here? So we don't know. We don't know how to get at that. Some of these lists may actually be there and be provided in the order they are, and with the groups that are there for particular theological lessons, and perhaps for reasons that we may not be able to reconstruct. But they do vary. And here in this one, in Judges 5, which many people would argue, well, both of these are poetic. And knowing lineages and where you belong is often a function of poetry, because it locks it in. Poetry you can't change easily, because you lose meter and you lose the kind of connection. So here's Judges, and Judges leaves out, of all groups, Judah. Well, Simeon too, as well as Levi. So we have to be open and flexible here. I don't know if people can read. This is in red, and unfortunately, Leah, Jacob's wife, the red shaded ones, and then white. And actually, it should not be white here. It should be the blue. That actually is supposed to be blue that we have here for Dan and Naphtali. So here
Judges 5 is really, it really minimizes Leah, because Judah and Simeon are omitted, and Levi and Reuben is given a negative blessing or judgment in that regard.
And it's interesting that there are many scholars who would argue that that's the oldest poem of all the ones up there, the one that figures in the Judges 5 story. So the history that emerges from that poem may represent the earliest history.
So I think we probably could allow some flexibility as we understand them, because there are different reasons for the listings. There is potential for fluidity and flexibility with these groups. So we should probably pay attention to that and let it be a learning tool. Let it be an educational moment. That, okay, why is this the case? And we keep working to find out. We don't have all the answers.
You know, some archaeologists have thought maybe we can find the pottery that has slight differences based on the geographical area assigned to these various tribes. And so they've looked on the ground where we know various tribes lived and compared the pottery between them. And I don't know how successful that effort has been. Probably not very.
We have northern varieties during the time of the Kingdom of Israel and southern Judahite types. But I don't think we can identify any tribal identities.
No, there you have strong, sometimes support for, but sometimes antagonism between the groups. So you would be different. You want to be contrasting.
But we don't see it in the pottery. Pots and people. That whole discussion. Can you identify people groups by their pots?
And they moved around some, didn't they? We think of Dan for instance, was assigned to the area near the Philistine coast, and he seems to have gotten squeezed out, and he ends up clear in the north of the country, in among the 10 tribes.
Another question that arises and that comes up in these chapters in Deuteronomy has to do with this unique phrase. It's tied to Moses and it's tied to Aaron. To be gathered to your ancestors. And so I thought I would put a few illustrations of burial, community burial chambers. And Larry talked to us about Jericho and the kinds of burials we're talking about here.
Well, a very famous British female archaeologist named Kathleen Kenyon was the one who excavated these tombs at Jericho. And you can see that the bones, there's no rhyme nor reason to the placement of these bones. You see the skulls very obviously there and some of the long bones, but everything is all mixed up. It's as though these bones were in a bag that the nomads carried around, and then when they got to the ancestral burying ground or burial cave, they brought their bag out and just sort of emptied them there. And maybe that's what gathering them to their fathers actually meant.
We are doing some research, Kent, on this particular burial facility, a dolmen, what is called a dolmen.
Describe a little bit what a dolmen is.
Kent, do this for us, and then talk about the research that's going on.
Well, dolmens are found all the way from Ireland through Northern Europe on down through the Middle East, lots in Jordan, Israel. Pretty much to India. And they were burial tombs, probably family burial tombs, especially with nomadic groups. So you go back in Europe to, pre-Celtic times. And they would bring their deceased relatives back to bury them in the family tomb. Think of Abraham with his tomb at Machpelah. We excavated this, and it's very rare to find any sorts of either grave goods or human remains in them.
Right.
A couple of tombs, dolmens have fragments of humans,
Right.
or maybe one has some burial goods.
Right.
This is an amazing find, and we're working now to do ancient DNA analysis on that, to be able to determine the affinities with other population groups, and to reconstruct the facial features, like National Geographic does.
Yes.
And to do other morphological studies. How tall were these people? What kind of diseases did they have? Malnutrition was a real problem at this time. Early agricultural communities didn't really have good nutrition during the winter times, and we can see that in the bones.
The bones actually show it quite clearly.
They do.
And I think if I heard the report correctly, we're looking at maybe 28 individuals now.
Initially we thought maybe 19, but we now know that 20, upper 20s,
Right.
28 perhaps, are represented.
And a number of very small children.
Yes,
Lots
yes.
of, 5 to 10-year-olds, and then some
Mhm.
teenagers as well. So, and we're doing the DNA. We're working with several other specialists
Right.
in Southern California from several different universities. And with the DNA, I mean, can DNA tell us if they were really gathered to the bones of their patriarchs, to their other
Well, if
their
we
families,
if we
ancestors?
can extract enough intact DNA, we can.
Yeah.
The nuclear DNA is what we're going for. We'll
So
see.
That's part of archaeology today. Larry, I think you had something to do with this excavation.
Yeah, this is a Roman period tomb, family tomb, that comes from the time of Jesus. And of course, the most interesting feature is that it was sealed by a rolling stone, the same kind that is described in the Gospels that Jesus was buried in. And you can see the niches once you get inside where the family members were buried.
Do you know if anything has been done with these burials in terms of ancient DNA?
Not to my knowledge, no. You know, that illustrates the difference between our work at Hespan, which was 40 years ago,
Right.
and the work that we're doing now. There are new techniques that have been developed, and we're much more careful
Right.
with the bones than we were in those days. The fact that we saved them was important
Was
back
actually
those. It was
new
quite
then,
new
too.
then, right? Yeah,
I mean, animal and human.
right, right.
Right.
Mhm.
And so some promise from ancient DNA analysis on these bones. That's very good. Thank you, Kent, and thank you, Larry, and thank all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope that the program has provided something for you to think about and something to contribute to the development of your faith. And we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.